The internet is a truly wonderful thing. Any known fact is at your fingertips. But ironically, the world has never been more confusing. It seems that the more information we have, the more difficult it is to make sense of it. Even facts about current events are in dispute. Not to mention that discussions of them are more like pledges of allegiance to opposite political tribes. This is not what it was like in traditional culture, when events took their meanings from a shared religion. Of course, we're better off now with all our creature comforts and growing power over nature. But we don't know what to do with our power over nature. We don't know how to make sense of our place in the world. We don't know what to aspire to, or even how to judge people. We are tolerant. We want everyone to be treated equally. But we no longer share a standard by which to recognize excellence. We have celebrities, but no heroes. To make sense of our world, what we need is a big picture. I mean, a picture that has a meaningful place for everything. One that does tell us what is good. And it can't be one that we accept on faith. It must be a picture that we know is true and that everyone can accept. I assume that you agree it would be a good thing to have such a big picture. And the good news is that it is available. I mean, available now. That's what I'm offering in this video. This big picture is as naturalistic as science because it is also an explanation of the natural world. It doesn't depend on faith in God or any religion. It uses the empirical method to discover what is true. It holds that beliefs are true because they correspond to what exists in the natural world. And it is at least as true as science because it explains everything that science has discovered. But it also discovers the true with a capital T because it's a deeper explanation of the natural world than science. It explains what we find there by the first cause, that is, by the cause of its existence, rather than the laws of nature that govern its behavior. Since existence is a property that everything in the world has, it is a complete explanation of what exists. It explains the meaning of everything in the world because the good, with a capital G, is part of the true, with a capital T. What really exists is reality. And so what makes this big picture true is its correspondence to reality. And we can know that it's true because it is a complete explanation of the nature of the world. It is so complete that it leaves no grounds for doubting it. Naturalists must admit that such a big picture is not impossible. It is, after all, the goal of science. But its immediate availability sounds too good to be true. I insist, however, that it is available now. But the bad news is that it's an argument. It's not just a meme that can go viral, nor mere talking points meant to amuse you. Instead, it starts with a plausible but unusual place. It makes a series of inferences, some of which are big and novel, and these steps follow a path that eventually explains everything in the world, tying them all together as parts of a big picture of the kind I have just described. Now, I don't assume that anyone is eager to consider a long, all-inclusive argument. These days, almost no one believes that argument can settle basic disagreements. After decades of fruitless debates about abortion, not many will have the patience to consider what I have to offer. But it's about something valuable, and I know that some of you have a lingering faith in the rational pursuit of truth. I've listened to many long discussions on YouTube in which speakers harken back to the Enlightenment and worry that its legacy is vanishing from our culture. They see name-calling as replacing serious argument. They are afraid that cancel culture will silence reason. Those videos had many viewers, and they must also have been nostalgic about the belief in cultural progress. And if you're one of those who would like to see the enlightenment restored, this is an argument that you must consider. Since you have a lingering faith in reason, you realize that our only chance of discovering what is true is by taking argument seriously. As someone who believes in the rational pursuit of truth, you know that you have a duty to consider serious arguments before dismissing them. And I am offering a serious argument. I'm asking you to follow me until we come to a step that you know is falsified by what is found in the natural world, or that you know is impossible for some other reason. If we come to such a point, you can get off in good conscience, but not until then. It's an argument that you can follow because it depends only on our ordinary way of understanding the natural world. I call it naturalistic imagination because it's the faculty built into our animal brains for thinking about the relations of objects in space and how motion changes them. It's the faculty that enables us to understand geometry. At no step in this argument will you have to accept anything that cannot be understood in naturalistic imagination. If you follow me, you will see how the big picture I have described is available now, and you will be in a position to judge its truth for yourself. It is necessarily a long argument, since it explains everything in the world, and so I will survey the 5 big steps involved. That will enable you to see how the argument is situated in our world, and how it manages to explain every last thing in the world. These steps are new and surprising, so it won't be obvious that they are true. But since you can understand them in naturalistic imagination, you will know they're not impossible. The argument is all-inclusive because it covers all the issues that arise in both science and philosophy. To my knowledge, none of these steps has previously been defended. And so, if you're familiar with science or philosophy, you will at least find them interesting. I predict that in retrospect, what this argument reveals about the world will seem obvious. All basic discoveries seem that way because they solve problems that previously seemed intractable. And the discovery on which all these conclusions depend resolves issues in both science and philosophy, not to mention religion. It turns out that both sides of traditional disputes have part of the truth, and the beliefs that remain are central enough that giving up the false beliefs is costless. Thus, if you have enough faith in the rational pursuit of truth to take this argument seriously, you will see how the scientific explanation of the world can become so complete that no grounds are left for doubting it. You will see how a single discovery enables science to explain the essential nature of everything in the natural world, including philosophy. You will see how science becomes reason with a capital R and discovers the true with a capital T. This is the big picture. I call it naturalistic reason. This is a diagram of the entire argument. The foundation at the bottom is the defense of a naturalistic ontology, and its conclusion at the top is naturalistic reason. Ontology is a study of what exists most basically, and I assume that it is a theory about the substances constituting the world. Since they explain what is found in the world by constituting it, they explain its existence. And since this ontology is an explanation of what is found in the natural world, it is a naturalistic ontology. Naturalistic reason is the conclusion, the big picture. The arrows represent paths of inferences from ontology to this conclusion. The path on the left is an ontological explanation of science, and since science studies the natural world, ontology discovers what really exists in the natural world. The natural world is reality with a capital R. The path on the right side is a scientific explanation of philosophy, made possible by reducing science to ontology. It turns out that Western philosophy was the study of appearance. And so the path on the right is an ontological explanation of appearance, with a capital A. But reality is prior to appearance, and since this argument is based on a discovery about the natural world, reason at the top, knowing ontology at the bottom, is naturalistic reason, knowing reality. That is the big picture. This is the first big step in this argument, the reduction of physics to ontology. Ontology is the study of the substances constituting the world, and ontology uses the empirical method to establish itself as a more basic branch of science than physics. It infers the kinds of substances that constitute the natural world as the best explanation of physics. Ontology uses interactions of substances to explain regularities about change, and since laws of physics are formulated mathematically, it begins by inferring kinds of substances whose interactions explain the appropriateness of mathematics for formulating laws of physics. The substances it discovers can generate only quantitatively precise regularities. Then it infers the powers by which those substances interact as the best explanations of the regularities described by laws of physics. It has not previously been defended. And since its explanations can all be understood in naturalistic imagination, it solves the puzzles of modern physics. For example, it explains the regularities described by quantum mechanics without having to believe that particles can be in more than one place at the same time. In retrospect, it will be obvious that the puzzles of modern physics are caused by the assumption that mathematically formulated laws of nature are the deepest possible empirical knowledge of what really exists. And so the puzzles are solved by the discovery of the substances that explain them. Now this diagram adds the second big step, the reduction of all the other branches of science to ontology. This is possible because the reduction of quantum mechanics to ontology reveals a kind of efficient cause that is not recognized by physics. Its laws describe how particles move and interact, and the efficient causes identified by those regularities are called physical causes. The new kind of efficient cause is just as basic, and I call them geometrical causes, because the shapes of material bodies, from atoms to all the bodies composed of atoms, can constrain what happens by physical causes. That is, the ontological solution to the puzzles of quantum mechanics reveal that physics is mistaken in believing that composite bodies can be reduced to physical causes. Their geometrical structures are generated by interactions of the same basic substances, but in a different way, and so the motion and interaction of their shapes can constrain what happens by physical causes, at least when energy ranges are right. This is a new way of explaining regularities about change, and it solves all the seemingly intractable problems confronting specialized branches of science, from chemistry and molecular biology to neurology and social science. It begins with a deeper and more complete explanation of evolution than Darwinism, one that does explain the origin of life on suitable planets everywhere. And since the origin of life reveals the essential nature of life, it explains the nature of the good. It is an aspect of the nature of life. Ontology discovers a regularity about the overall course of evolution in which a series of levels of organization in evolving geometrical causes are responsible for a series of stages of gradual evolution that lead inevitably to the existence of animals like us with the use of language. Thus it discovers the essential natures of every part of the natural order that comes into existence by evolution. The language-using animals at the top are called reflective subjects because the language they used enables them to represent their own psychological states to themselves and one another. And using beliefs and desires to explain behavior, they can literally see into one another's minds. This diagram adds the third big step. The arrow from naturalistic ontology to qualia represents the ontological solution to the so-called hard problem of mind. When we perceive the natural world, we have sensory qualia, including colors, sounds, odors, and the like. And they're not explained by a science based on physics, since they are phenomenal appearances. Laws of physics discover efficient causes, which explain what happens. But since efficient causes do not explain phenomenal appearances, their existence is a problem for science. But in a science based on ontology, regularities about change are generated by interactions of substances, and so it has ontological causes as well as efficient causes to explain what is found in the natural world. Thus, ontology can solve the hard problem by inferring that substances constituting the world have phenomenal intrinsic properties as the best explanation of the qualia found in the natural world. Qualia are simply what it is like to be some substances constituting the natural world. But unlike the intrinsic properties responsible for efficient causes, phenomenal intrinsic properties are not expressed as ways that substances interact with one another, and so phenomenal properties have no effect on what happens. This is called epiphenomenalism, and its implications are represented by the upward arrow from qualia. This diagram adds the fourth step, and unlike the previous steps, there are two arrows representing its dependence on previous steps. The arrow from specialized sciences represents the ontological explanations of reflective subjects, including how their brains enable them to use language. And combined with the arrow from qualia, it explains why reflective subjects are conscious. Perception, for example, involves complex configurations of qualia that seem to be related to one another in a three-dimensional space where the body is also located. Reflection involves fainter and more confused configurations of qualia. Ontology can identify the substances helping constitute the brain whose phenomenal intrinsic properties are responsible for consciousness as the best explanation of the configuration of qualia in three-dimensional space. Thus, ontology discovers that consciousness is what it is like to be a brain in the natural world with the use of language. But normally, reflective subjects fail to distinguish between reflection, which is a cognitive faculty that depends on how a language-using brain works, and consciousness, which is what it is like to be such a brain. Thus, the ontological explanation of consciousness shows that it involves an illusion, intuitionism, which leads reflective subjects to assume that knowledge depends on faculties of intuition. The intuitionist delusion is the foundation for an ontological explanation of philosophy as the study of appearance, with a capital A. Appearance is consciousness, or part of it, and the illusion is that knowledge depends on faculties of intuition. It allows reflective subjects to believe that they have a cognitive faculty called reason that enables them to know reality behind appearance. This is metaphysics, the traditional philosophical argument that claims to discover the true with a capital T. But since it explains reason as a faculty of rational intuition, ontology calls it intuitionistic metaphysics. It is an explanation of the history of Western philosophy. This diagram adds the fifth and final step. The ontological reductions of science and philosophy are represented as jointly entailing naturalistic reason. On the left side, ontology explains the overall course of evolution as a series of stages caused by a series of levels of geometrical organization that lead inevitably to reflective subjects. It is mainly culture that evolves in groups of reflective subjects, and all human beings have the use of psychological sentences. But on the right side, ontology explains the history of Western philosophy as the exploration of every possible way of basing a metaphysical argument on the assumption that reason is a faculty of intuition. But the use of metaphysical arguments is a higher level of linguistic organization in culture than psychological sentences, and so a science based on ontology discovers that Western civilization is a stage of gradual evolution that follows the stage of evolution represented by other civilizations on Earth. Of course, intuitionist metaphysics is mistaken about the nature of reason, and so it is mistaken about the nature of reality. But since the use of language to formulate such arguments leads metaphysicians to insist that all of our beliefs correspond to a single reality, it imposes a higher standard of coherence on the acceptance of arguments. That causes culture to evolve at a higher order of functional powers. These powers are generally acknowledged as the Enlightenment, and the greater functional power of Western civilization is confirmed by the globalization of its offspring, science, liberal political institutions, and capitalism. Since science sees through the illusion of intuitionism, it corrects the mistake of intuitionistic metaphysics, and thus, when a science based on ontology discovers this explanation of Western civilization as a distinct stage of evolution, science discovers that ontology is a form of reason knowing appearance as part of reality. But since ontologists are conscious reflective subjects who also suffer the illusion of intuitionism, they understand what intuitionists meant by appearance. Thus, naturalistic reason is also reason knowing reality behind appearance. Thus, science and philosophy both have naturalistic reason, and so they are united in their acceptance of the big picture, naturalistic metaphysics. These diagrams are a map of the big picture. It is a series of steps that lead from a naturalistic ontology to naturalistic reason, so that naturalistic reason can look back on naturalistic ontology as reality. They are big steps, and none is obvious, let alone expected. The first two steps make sense, since the goal of science has long been a unified explanation of everything. Nor is it implausible that the goal would be attained by reducing physics and other branches of science to a more basic branch of science that has a deeper and more complete description of what really exists than physics. But the confusion of contemporary culture makes it seem that like pie in the sky. The last two steps, on the other hand, come out of left field. Neuroscientists have not yet explained how the human brain enables us to reflect on our psychological states, and they are just beginning to recognize that they must also solve the hard problem of mind. They will eventually recognize the difference between reflection and consciousness and insist on the distinction. But like others in this age of multiculturalism, scientists will probably recoil at the notion that the solution to these problems shows that Western civilization is a later stage of human evolution than other civilizations on Earth. But again, no matter how skeptical naturalists may be about the availability of this big picture, it is not obviously impossible. From the diagram of the complete argument, you can see how these steps fit together in a way that could be an explanation of everything. Ontology describes what exists most basically, and a naturalistic ontology could explain not only the nature of the reality studied by science, that is the natural world in which we find our animal bodies, but also the nature of the appearance studied by philosophy. If it solved all the problems of both science and philosophy, it would leave no reasonable grounds for doubting that naturalistic metaphysics corresponds to reality. We could be certain that it is knowledge of the true, with a capital T. Such a discovery will take some getting used to, but as I said, in retrospect, it will seem obvious. It will seem obvious because we will know how all the problems of science and philosophy are solved by the discovery of what constitutes the natural world. That it is not just matter, but also a substance that interacts with matter, called space. Space is not just the geometrical structure of the natural world as if it were a mere container that gives material bodies spatial relations to one another. It is a substance that interacts with matter. Their interactions generate all the regularities described by laws of physics and reveals that matter has a geometrical power not recognized by physics. Thus, a discovery about the nature of space solves all the problems confronting other sciences. It also enables ontology to explain consciousness and to put the lie to intuitionism. I don't see how you can know that any of these steps are contrary to what is found in the natural world. Nor do I see how you can know that any of them is impossible in some other way. So if you believe in the rational pursuit of truth, I do not see how you can dismiss the possibility of naturalistic reason in good conscience. On the other hand, none of these steps is obviously true. You surely have questions about them, and answers to many of such questions are contained in 5 more videos, each describing one of these steps in greater detail. You may still be skeptical about the solutions to some of the more technical issues that these steps involve, and the argument I am offering has solutions to many technical problems. The complete argument is presented in 3 books that are being e-published more or less as these videos come out. The trilogy is titled Naturalistic Reason, and the volumes are titled the Unification of Physics, the Unification of Science, and the Unification of Science and Philosophy. The first 2 videos correspond to the first 2 volumes, and the 3rd volume defends the final 3 steps. So they show where to look for answers for more technical questions. The claim to have such an argument is so unexpected that it may seem preposterous. If such a big picture were available now, surely someone would already have discovered it. But no one has, and watching our inheritance from the Enlightenment crumble, those who believe in rational discourse know that the need for a defense of reason could not be greater. There are forces taking advantage of disillusionment with reason to seize political power. We are in danger of losing our freedom of speech. Nothing would be more valuable to those who believe in the rational pursuit of truth than a credible way of discovering the true with a capital T. It would restore the Enlightenment. It is always darkest before the dawn. That is how it always looks before discoveries are made. And the big discoveries often do not come from professionals who have established a career in the relevant disciplines. They're blinkered by their success. Discoveries come from out of left field. In this case, I'm the outsider, and my way of presenting naturalistic reason is so unusual that perhaps I should say something about it. I'm over 80 years old, and I've worked on this argument all my life. In the 20 years since retiring from teaching philosophy, I've had the time to work out the details and put it all together in this form. But having completed it, I can find no publishers that are willing to consider a trilogy, especially not one written by an unpublished author that defends heresies on all fronts. Fortunately, I've lived long enough to benefit from the digital revolution, and so I am making it public as e-published books, internet videos, social media, and the like. Finally, an apology and a promise. I said that the entire trilogy is being e-published now, but that's not quite true. Part of the first volume, The Unification of Physics, is the reduction of general relativity to ontology, and though it's all worked out, it's not written in a way that fits neatly into this trilogy. That doesn't undermine this defense of naturalistic metaphysics, because I lay out the argument about general relativity in the first 2 volumes, and physicists will be able to see how their equations correspond to it. And I promise to present it with all the relevant equations when and if I have the time. But in this pandemic, a coronavirus may have my name on it, and so my age and underlying conditions force me to act now. Our society has favored me with the privilege of spending my life working on this argument, not to mention the joy of making the discoveries it involves. But if I don't pay back now what I owe, it may be too late.